The sun glowed at the earth, scorching the plains until the ground split like old leather. Dust swirled in her wake, clinging to her torn skirts as she stumbled forward. Her lips were cracked, her throat raw with thirst. The canteen at her hip was light to light, and the horizon offered nothing but a shimmering lie of salvation. She'd been walking for days, maybe longer. Time blurred in the heat, each step a battle against the weight of her own body. Her hands trembled, clutching the frayed ribbon of her bonnet, long since useless against the relentless glare. Somewhere behind her lay the life she'd fled, a cold room, a stranger's name, a father's hand signing her away. Ahead, nothing, just the endless, uncaring sprawl of the Wyoming territory. Her knees buckled, and she caught herself on a jagged rock, skin tearing under her palm. The pain was distant, like a voice calling from another room. She sank to the ground, breath hitching, and stared at the blood pooling in her hand. It was the only color in a world of brown and gray. The buzzards had found her hours ago, their shadows circling lazily above. They knew. The land always knew when something was ready to die. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she saw her mother's face, soft, sad, framed by the laced curtains of a home she'd never see again. "You'll be fine," her mother had whispered before the fever took her. Fine. The word tasted like ash. Now a sound broke the silence, not thunder, not hooves, but the creak of wood. Her eyes snapped open. A wagon shimmered in the distance, its canvas flapping like a wounded bird. She tried to stand, but her legs betrayed her, folding like brittle twigs. The world tilted and she fell, cheek pressed to the hot earth. Footsteps crunched closer, slow and deliberate. She didn't move, couldn't. A shadow fell over her, blocking the sun's wrath. She waited for a voice, a hand, anything, but there was only silence, heavy as a stone. The man's boots were worn, the leather cracked and caked with dust. He knelt, his face half hidden by the brim of his hat, eyes dark and unreadable. He didn't speak, just held out a canteen. Water sloshed inside, a sound so sweet it hurt. She reached for it, fingers shaking, and drank too fast, choking on the coolness. He steadied her wrist, his touch rough but not cruel. "Slow," he said, voice low, like gravel underfoot. She nodded, gasping, and drank again, tears mixing with the water on her chin. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask why a woman was alone in a place that chewed up men twice her size. He just stood, squinting at the horizon, then offered it a hand. She stared at it, calloused, scarred, the knuckles bruised, a hand that had fought and lost and fought again. She took it, and he pulled her up, her weight nothing to him. The wagon was close now, a mule staring at her with dull, patient eyes. He gestured toward it, and she climbed in, every muscle screaming. The canvas smelled of sweat and tobacco, the floor strewn with sacks of flour and a coiled rope. She sat, clutching her knees, and watched him walk back to the mule. The wagon lurched forward, and the world moved again. She didn't know where they were going, didn't care. The sun still burned, but the shadow of the canvas was a small mercy. She leaned back, her head against a sack, and let the rhythm of the wheels lull her. For the first time in days, she wasn't alone, but the weight in her chest didn't lift. It never would, she thought, not after what she'd left behind. Her eyes drifted to the man's back, broad and hunched, his hat low against the glare. He hadn't looked at her since helping her up. She wondered what kind of man picked up a stranger in the wilderness. A day fool, maybe, or a man with nothing left to lose. Her fingers traced the ribbon in her lap, the last piece of who she'd been. She didn't notice when her eyes closed, or when the wagon's sway carried her into a dreamless sleep. The wagon's creak woke her, a jagged sound cutting through the haze of sleep. Her body ached, stiff against the flour sacks. And the air was cooler now, the sun sinking into a bruise of orange and purple. The plains stretched endless around them, dotted with sagebrush and the bones of things long dead. She sat up, clutching the ribbon in her lap, its frayed ends soft against her fingers. The man hadn't turned, his silhouette steady as the mule plodded on. Dust rose in their wake, curling like smoke in the dying light. Her mind drifted, unmoored by the quiet. She saw her father's parlor, the air thick with cigar smoke and the scratch of his pen. "It's a good match," he'd said, not looking at her. The man he'd chosen was older, his eyes cold as river stones, his hands too eager when they'd met. She'd stood silent, her voice buried under years of obedience. But that night, she'd packed a bag, her mother's ribbon, a shawl, a few coins, and slipped out under the moon. The train took her west, far as her money allowed, then the stagecoach, then nothing but her own feet and the weight of a choice. She couldn't unmake. The wagon slowed, and she blinked, pulled back to the present. The man was looking at her now, his face weathered, lines carved deep around his mouth. Not old, but worn, like the land itself. "You got a name?" he asked, voice rough but not unkind. She hesitated, her tongue heavy. The name she'd been born with felt like a chain, now tied to a life she'd burned. "Clara," she said finally, the word soft, half a lie. It was her mother's name, not hers, but it fit better than the truth. He nodded, like it didn't much matter. Eliassi turned back to the mule, flicking the reins. "We'll stop soon. Ground's better up ahead." She didn't ask where they were going. The question felt too big, too fragile. Instead, she watched the horizon, where the sky bled into the earth. A coyote's howl rose in the distance, sharp and lonely. Her chest tightened, and she pressed her palm against it, willing the ache to fade. It didn't. They stopped near a shallow creek, the water glinting like shattered glass, under the stars. Elias built a fire, his movements sure and silent, the kind of quiet that came from years alone. She watched him, her hands idle, useless. He handed her a tin of beans, warmed by the flames, and a spoon. The metal was cold against her lips, the food heavy in her empty stomach. She ate slowly, savoring the warmth while the fire crackled and the creek whispered, "You're running?" he asked, not looking at her, his eyes on the flames, her spoon stilled. The truth pressed against her ribs, sharp as a blade. "Yes," she said, barely a whisper. He nodded again, like he'd known before he asked. "Most folks out here are." He poked the fire, sparks rising into the dark. "Don't much matter what from, just matters where to." She didn't answer, she didn't know where to. The thought of a place, a purpose felt like chasing smoke. She set the tin down, her hands shaking, and pulled her shawl tighter. The night was cold now, the stars sharp as needles. Elias stood, brushing dirt from his knees, and tossed her a blanket from the wagon. It smelled of horse and dust, but it was warm. She wrapped it around herself, grateful for the weight. He lay down across the fire, hat over his face, one hand resting on the rifle at his side. She stared at the flames, her mind heavy with questions she wouldn't ask. Why he'd stopped for her, what he wanted. If he was running to fire's glow softened the harsh lines of his face, and for a moment, he looked less like a stranger. But the thought passed, swallowed by the dark. She curled up near the wagon, the blanket rough against her cheek. The creek's murmur lulled her, and she closed her eyes, the ribbon still clutched in her hand. Sleep came slow, haunted by the echo of her father's voice, the clink of a stranger's coins, and the sound of her own footsteps, running. Asterisk. The dawn came slow, a thin line of gold bleeding across the horizon. Clara woke to the scent of smoke and sage, her body stiff against the hard earth. The fire was dead, only gray ash and a faint curl of heat left behind. Elias was already up, saddling the mule, his movements precise, like a man who'd done this 1,000 mornings. She sat up, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, and her fingers brushed the ribbon, still tangled in her hand. The air was sharp, cutting through her shawl, and she shivered as she watched him work. He didn't look at her, didn't speak, just handed her a biscuit from a tin, hard as stone but edible. She chewed slowly, the dryness sticking in her throat. The creek glistened nearby, its surface catching the light like a promise. She knelt beside it, splashing water on her face, the cold biting her skin. Her reflection stared back hollow-eyed, a stranger's face framed by matted hair. She looked the way, tucking the ribbon into her sleeve. They moved on, the wagon creaking under the weight of silence. The plains gave way to rolling hills, dotted with scrub oak and patches of dry grass. Clara's mind wandered, snagged on memories she couldn't shake. Her father's voice, low and final. "You'll marry him or you'll have nothing." The man's hand on her wrist, his smile sharp as a blade. The train's whistle as she fled, her heart pounding louder than the wheels. She'd thought freedom would feel lighter, but it was heavy, like carrying a stone no one else could see. Elias stopped the wagon at midday, the sun high and merciless. He pointed to a ridge in the distance, where a cluster of cottonwoods stood like sentinels. "My place," he said. The words clipped. She nodded, unsure what it meant. A house, a claim. She didn't ask. The mule plodded on, and she watched the trees grow closer, their leaves whispering in the breeze. It was the first green she'd seen in days, and it stirred something in her chest. Hope maybe, or just the ghost of it. The homestead was small, a sod house dug into the hillside, its roof patched with tarp and wood. A corral stood empty, the fence half broken, and a dry garden plot lay abandoned, choked with weeds. Elias climbed down, his boots kicking up dust, and started unloading sacks from the wagon. Clara hesitated, then followed, her hands clumsy as she carried a bag of flour to the door. Inside, the air was cool and musty, the walls bare except for a rusted rifle and a faded quilt draped over a chair. It smelled of earth and loneliness. He didn't tell her to stay, didn't ask her to leave, just handed her a bucket and pointed to a well near the cottonwoods. She worked in silence, drawing water, her arms aching with each pull. The rhythm steadied her, gave her something to hold on to. Elias chopped wood nearby, the axe's thud a counterpoint to her thoughts. She watched him from the corner of her eye, his shoulders tense, his face unreadable. What kind of man lived like this, alone in a place that fought to keep you? She didn't know, but she felt the weight of his own ghosts in the way he moved. But evening, they sat by a fire outside, the sky deepening to indigo. He offered her coffee, bitter and strong, in a tin cup that burnt her fingers. She sipped it, staring at the flames, and felt the question rise before she could stop it. "Why'd you help me?" He didn't answer right away, just leaned back, his hat tipped low, and watched the stars. Didn't have a reason not to. he said finally. Land's big. Takes more than one to hold it. She frowned, the words settling unevenly. Was it pity, duty, something else? She didn't press. The fire popped, sending sparks into the night, and she thought of her mother's ribbon, tucked against her wrist, a tether to a past she couldn't return to, and a future she couldn't see. Elias shifted, his shadow long across the ground, and she wondered if he saw the same emptiness in the stars. Asterisk, asterisk, the days blurred into one another, marked by the rhythm of work and the slow turn of the sun. Clara woke each morning to the sound of Elias's boots on the packed earth, the clank of the bucket as he drew water from the well. The homestead demanded everything: mending fences, hauling wood, coaxing life from the stubborn garden plot. Her hands blistered, then calloused, the skin splitting like the land itself. She didn't mind. The ache gave her something to feel besides the hollow in her chest. Elias spoke little, his words sparse as the rain, but he taught her things: how to mend a harness, how to spot a storm coming over the hills. His hands moved with a quiet certainty, and she watched them, learning the language of survival. At night, they sat by the fire, the silence between them less heavy now, like a river smoothing stones. She didn't ask about his past, and he didn't ask about hers, but sometimes, when the wind carried the howl of a wolf, she caught him staring at the horizon, his eyes distant, carrying a weight she couldn't name. Her dreams were restless, tangled with memories. The parlor again, her father's pen scratching, the stranger's laugh low and cruel, her mother's voice, faint as a whisper, "You'll be fine." But it was another memory that cut deeper now. A boy, no older than 10, his hand small and cold in hers. Her brother left behind when she fled. She'd promised to come back for him, but the miles between them felt like a canyon she couldn't cross. She woke once, gasping, her face wet with tears, and found Elias watching her from across the fire. He didn't speak, just tossed her another log to burn. One morning, as she hoed the garden, a shadow fell across the dirt. Elias stood there, holding a paper, its edges yellowed and creased. "This is the deed," he said, voice flat. "Land's mine. Been mine since I came out here." He paused, his eyes on the paper. "Not her. Could be yours too, if you stay." She froze, the hoe heavy in her hands. The words didn't make sense, not at first. Land hers. The idea was too big, like trying to hold the sky. "Why?" she asked, her voice rough. He shrugged, folding the paper. "I ain't got no one else." He walked away, leaving her staring at the dirt, her heart pounding. She thought of the ribbon in her sleeve, her mother's name, her brother's face. Could she stay? Build something here, in this hard, unyielding place? The thought scared her more than the desert had. That night, she sat by the fire, the deed on her lap. Elias was mending a bridle, his fingers deft despite the scars. She wanted to ask him about the land, about the life he'd lived before her, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she said, "I had a brother." Her voice cracked, and she hated it. "I left him." Elias didn't look up, but his hands stilled. "Folks leave things behind," he said after a moment. "Don't mean you can't go back." She swallowed, the fire's heat stinging her eyes. "What if I can't?" He set the bridle down, his gaze meeting hers for the first time. "In days, then you make something new." The words hung there, simple and heavy. She looked at the deed, its ink faded but sure, and felt the weight of a choice she wasn't ready to make. Stay, and claim a life she didn't know how to live. Leave, and carry the ache of what she'd lost forever. The fire cracked, and a coyote called in the distance, its voice sharp against the quiet. She folded the deed, her fingers trembling, and tucked it beside the ribbon. Elias went back to his work, the firelight carving shadows on his face. The stars above were endless, cold, and beautiful, and for the first time, she wondered if they could guide her somewhere new. Asterisk, asterisk, the wind carried a chill now, whispering through the cottonwoods as autumn crept into the hills. Clara worked the garden with a quiet focus, her hands steady despite the cold earth biting her knuckles. The soil was stubborn, but small green shoots had begun to break through, fragile as hope. She didn't know if they'd survive the frost, but she tended them anyway, each sprout a defiance against the land's indifference. Elias watched sometimes, leaning against the corral, his silence less heavy now, like he was waiting for something to take root in her too. The deed stayed folded in her pocket, its weight a constant presence. She hadn't spoken of it since he'd offered, and he hadn't pressed. But the question hung between them, unspoken. In the way he left a second plate at supper, or the way he'd fixed the sod house door to keep out the wind. She felt it in the space he gave her, not just the land, but the room to decide what it meant. It scared her, that kind of trust. She'd never known a man to give without taking. Her thoughts turned often to her brother, his small face sharp. In her memory, she saw him in the firelight, in the glint of the creek, in the way the wind tugged at her shawl. She'd written a letter once, late at night, her pencil shaking as she scratched out words she couldn't send. No address, no way to reach him. The paper was still tucked under her blanket, its edges curling like her resolve. Elias had seen her writing but said nothing, just handed her coffee the next morning like always. One evening, As the sky burned red, a stranger rode up. His horse was lean, its ribs sharp under dust-caked hide. The man was younger than Elias, his smile too easy, his eyes darting over the homestead like a hawk. Clara stiffened, her hand pausing on the bucket she carried. Elias stepped forward, rifle loose in his grip, his face unreadable. "Evening," the stranger said, tipping his hat. "Heard you got land worth seeing." His voice was smooth, but it carried an edge, like a blade wrapped in cloth. Elias didn't move. "Heard wrong," he said. "Just dirt and work here." The man laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. He looked at Clara, lingering too long, and she felt the old fear rise, the one she'd carried from her father's parlor. "Got company, I see," he said. "She yours?" Elias's jaw tightened, almost imperceptible. "She's her own," he said, the words low and final. The stranger's smile faltered, and he raised his hands, mock surrender. "Just passing through," he said, but his gaze lingered on the sod house, the corral, the garden. He rode off. As the sun sank, his shadow long and sharp across the plains, Clara's heart didn't slow until he was gone. She looked at Elias, expecting him to say something, but he just turned back to the fire, poking it with a stick. "Men like that," he said after a while, "they come for what ain't theirs. Always will." She nodded, her throat tight. She thought of the deed, of the land, of the life she might claim here, and she thought of her brother, waiting somewhere she couldn't reach. The choice felt like a rope, pulling her in two directions. Stay and build something with Elias, with this place. Go and find the boy she'd promised to save. Both felt like betrayal. That night, she sat by the fire, the deed in her hands. Elias was across from her, whittling a piece of wood, the knife's soft scrape blending with the crackle of flames. She wanted to ask him why he stayed, why he offered her this life when he barely knew her. But instead, she said, "You ever lose someone?" His knife paused, just for a moment. "Yeah," he said, eyes on the wood. "Wife, child, fever took him both." He didn't look up, but his voice was steady, like he'd carried the weight so long it was part of him. She swallowed the ribbon in her sleeve, heavy as iron. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He shrugged, the smallest lift of his shoulders. "Land's all I got left. Ain't much, but it's honest." She looked at the deed, then at the fire, its glow warm against the cold night. The choice wasn't clear, but for the first time, she felt the ground beneath her, solid and real. She wasn't ready to choose, but she wasn't running either. The frost came early, glazing the garden in a brittle sheen. Clara worked through the cold, her breath clouding as she covered the sprouts with burlap, her fingers numb but stubborn. The land fought her every step, but she fought back, driven by something she couldn't name. Elias watched from the corral, mending a fence, his silence a steady presence. The homestead felt smaller now, not in size but in the way it held them, like a hand curling around a fragile thing. Her dreams grew sharper, her brother's face clearer each night. She saw him in the snow, his coat too thin, his eyes searching. For her, she woke with his name on her lips, the ribbon damp in her fist. The letter she'd written lay under her blanket, its words a wound she couldn't close. She thought of sending it, but the town was a day's ride, and she had no address, only a hope that felt like drowning. Elias noticed her quiet, her hands slower at supper, but he didn't ask. He just left her coffee by the fire, the tin cup, warm against her palms. One morning, as the sun burned through the frost, Elias hitched the mule to the wagon. "Need supplies," he said, his hat low against the glare. "You coming?" She hesitated, the deed heavy in her pocket. Town meant people, questions, eyes like the stranger's, but it also meant a post office, a chance to send her letter, even if it went nowhere. She nodded, climbing onto the wagon, her shawl tight around her shoulders. The ride was long, the wheels rattling over ruts, the plains stretching endless under a sky too big. Elias didn't speak, but his presence was enough, a tether against the vastness. The town was small, a cluster of clapboard buildings hunched against the wind. Dust swirled down the main street, and faces turned as they passed hard men, tired women, children with dirt-streaked cheeks. Clara kept her eyes low, her hands clasped in her lap. Elias stopped at the general store, leaving her with the wagon, while he bartered inside. She clutched the letter, its edges soft from her touch, and watched a woman across the street sweep her porch, her movements weary but sure. It struck Clara, that quiet resilience, and she wondered if she could find it too. The post office was a shack, its counter manned by an old man with ink-stained fingers. She slid the letter across, her voice barely above a whisper. "No address, just a name. Can you hold it, case someone comes?" He nodded, his eyes kind but distant, and tucked it into a box. She left the weight in her chest lighter, but not gone. Back at the wagon, Elias was loading sacks, his face tense. "Trouble?" she asked, her voice low talk. He said, glancing at the street. "That rider from before. He's been asking about the land." Her stomach twisted, the stranger's smile flashing in her mind. She climbed onto the wagon, her hands tight on the ribbon. They rode back in silence, the sky darkening with clouds, the air heavy with the promise of snow. Clara felt the deed, in her pocket, its words a challenge she couldn't ignore. Stay and fight for this place. Leave and chase a brother who might be lost forever. The choice was a blade, cutting either way. That night, by the fire, she unfolded the deed, its ink stark against the worn paper. Elias sat across from her, sharpening his knife, the scrape a steady rhythm. "If I stay," she said, her voice trembling, "what's it mean?" He looked up, his eyes catching the firelight. "Means you're home," he said simply. "Means you got a name here, and ground to stand on." She nodded, her throat tight. The ribbon lay in her lap, her mother's name woven into its threads. She thought of her brother, of the letter waiting in town, of the land under her feet. The fire burned low, its warmth a small defiance against the cold. She wasn't sure what home meant, but for the first time, she wanted to find out. The snow began to fall, soft and silent, dusting the homestead like a prayer. Clara folded the deed, her fingers steady, and looked at Elias. He nodded, just once, and went back to his knife. The world was quiet, save for the fire's crackle and the snow's gentle hiss, and she felt something shift inside her, not peace, not yet, but a beginning.